The storm fury clawed at the edges of the world, its icy breath howling through the valley with a violence that rattled the ancient bones of the cabin. Kalen Brody sat by the hearth, the crackling fire throwing jagged shadows against the walls. He had seen winters far more brutal, but this one, the relentless howling wind, the biting cold, felt different. It felt like nature itself had twisted, something wild and untamed creeping just beneath the surface. Outside, the storm raged in a frenzy, a swirling mass of white that blurred the lines between earth and sky. But in the midst of it, Kalen felt an odd unease. It wasn't the storm itself, but a sensation that gnawed at him. Something unsettled in the quiet, something too still. The wind's howl was a chorus, but beneath it there was a silence that hummed too loudly. Then a sound pierced the darkness, a low, rasping growl filled with desperation. Kalen's breath hitched in his chest, his pulse quickening. He knew that sound all too well, the cry of an animal in distress. But this was different. It wasn't the usual frightened yelp or a panicked cry. It was something raw, primal, filled with a kind of terror that cut deep into his bones. His mind raced as he pushed himself to his feet, heart hammering as he moved toward the window. There, just beyond the reach of the porch lights, she stood, an enormous she-bear, her fur matted with snow, her massive frame a hulking shadow against the storm. But it wasn't her presence that froze Kalen in place. It was what lay beneath her paws. A tiny form, barely moving, nestled in the snow. Her cub. The moment stretched on, neither human nor bear making a sound. For a heartbeat, Kalen could feel the weight of her gaze, those deep amber eyes locking with his. It wasn't a glare of aggression. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in nature's rigid rules. A plea, a silent call for help. For a moment he did nothing, unsure of what to do. He had handled injured animals before. He'd seen foxes and birds and even a few wounded deer, but never a bear. Never this, never a mother in such agony. The tension hung heavy, the air itself thick with a bond that was strange and unnerving. Then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers finding the hem of his coat, the strap of his medical kit. The bear's gaze never left him, her massive body still, though her ears twitched with every movement. There was no growl of warning, no flash of claws, just an unspoken acknowledgement between them. She was trusting him. Outside, the world was nothing but a storm, the wind biting through his coat as he stepped onto the porch. The snow clung to him, heavy and wet. The mother bear stood, waiting but not retreating. A fragile truce had been forged between them. Kalen knelt beside the cub, the cold biting through his gloves as he checked its tiny chest. Shallow breaths. Too weak, too cold. The little one's pulse was faint, like a whisper that might vanish at any moment. Time seemed to stretch and collapse around him as he worked, hands moving quickly, but with care. He wrapped the cub in a thermal blanket, its body trembling as Kalen's breath misted in the air. The mother watched intently, never moving, but her presence was a constant hum in his mind. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting, testing him. The cub's breathing was shallow, too weak to survive on its own. Kalen didn't hesitate as he pulled out a vial of medicine, one he had used on countless other animals, but never with a bear. The mother's nostrils flared as she leaned forward, scenting the air, and for a brief moment Kalen felt the strangest connection, like she recognized the smell of forest herbs. He spoke softly to the cub, his voice a low murmur of reassurance, even though he knew it couldn't understand him. With the medicine administered, Kalen sat back, watching as the cub's body slowly began to respond. The tightness in his chest eased just a fraction as the cub's breathing deepened. The storm's ferocity seemed to fade for a moment, as if the world itself held its breath. Night fell, but Kalen didn't move. The porch had become a quiet sanctuary, a place where time seemed to stand still. The mother bear remained vigilant, her massive form casting a long shadow against the snow. She didn't growl, didn't make a sound. She simply watched. As the night stretched on, the cub's condition slowly improved, its breath steadying, its body warming beneath the blanket. The hours passed in silence. Every now and then, the mother bear would shift, her paws scraping the snow, but she never strayed far. Kaylin could feel the unspoken understanding between them. This was a partnership now, fragile and quiet, but real. In the midst of the storm, the wilderness had brought them together in a way he had never expected. As dawn broke, soft pinks and golds spilling across the valley, the cub stirred. Kaylin watched, his breath catching as the tiny creature blinked up at him, its eyes dull but alive. His heart surged with something he couldn't name, a kind of fierce hope, a realization that the bear's trust had not been misplaced. From that moment on, a strange routine developed. Each morning, Kaylin would step out, bringing food, medicine, and care. The bear no longer held back. Her watchful gaze softened into something more like quiet partnership. When Kaylin mixed the herbal remedies, she would lean in, sniffing the air, her eyes narrowing as if understanding the ritual. And the cub, tiny, fragile, but slowly growing, began to show signs of recovery. It wasn't quick. The cub's first attempts to lift its head were shaky. Its first attempts at food were tentative, a struggle. But with each victory, each first step, each bite, it grew stronger. And with every small success, the mother bear's rumbling purrs echoed in the cold, a sound that resonated deep in Kaylin's chest. Weeks passed, and the cub grew steadily, its feeble body now agile, its legs strong. Kaylin marveled at how quickly it learned, watching its first few clumsy steps, its confused attempts to interact with the world around it. The mother, too, began to relax. She would nudge the cub, encouraging it, stepping aside when Kaylin needed to work. There was a rhythm to their time together now, a quiet, steady understanding. Then came the day that nearly broke Kaylin's heart. The cub, now stronger and more confident, took its first real steps outside, moving toward the woods with a kind of hesitant curiosity. The mother followed closely, but she never took her eyes off Kaylin. As the cub ventured further, the mother paused and turned, meeting Kaylin's gaze with a quiet finality. For a long moment they stood there, man and bear, locked in an unspoken understanding. The cub, now steady on its feet, was ready to return to the wilderness. The storm had passed. Their time together was ending. Kaylin swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He had known this day was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. The mother bear turned away slowly, guiding her cub toward the forest, her steps deliberate, the two of them moving as one. Kaylin stood motionless, watching them disappear into the snow-covered woods, their forms blending with the landscape until they were nothing more than a memory. The porch was empty. The wind continued to howl, but there was a quietness now, a stillness that felt both peaceful and heavy. Kaylin smiled faintly, his heart full. He had witnessed something rare, a bond that transcended the rules of nature, a trust that had grown in the silence of the winter storm. And deep in the heart of the forest, the story of the man who had saved them would linger, carried on the wind and written in the snow.